About that time. Welcome to Crossroads Presbyterian Church. My name is Todd O'Connor, and along with my wife Jenny, we serve as the worship ministry directors here. And we are so glad you're here to join us this afternoon. It is a little rainy, but they say April showers bring May flowers. So lots of beauty ahead for us, including what you're about to experience today. We are very happy to be hosting the Milwaukee Area Messiah Community Chorus and Orchestra. The ensembles and the featured soloists are under the direction of my friend and colleague, Maestro Brian Deering, and I'm super delighted that these musicians are returned for what I think is their third spring concert program. And this is also being live streamed and recorded. A couple of quick announcements. We do respectfully request that you please silence all your electronic devices at this time. Also, there are restrooms located straight ahead and on the left as you exit the center doors of this sanctuary, and there are more restrooms at the far, far end of that straight hallway and up the stairs. Before the music making begins, I would like to briefly call your attention to the tall baskets you may have passed in the lobby. For years, MAMCCO has supported the work of the Milwaukee Rescue Mission, and there's more information about that organization in your printed program. Today's special free will offering will benefit the work and mission of this important organization, so I encourage you to be generous. And now let us open with a word of prayer. Creator God, thank you for the gift of music, which cheers our hearts, helps us feel deeply, and allows us to pray profoundly. May the sounds and words performed today be a blessing to each of us present, and most especially to you. We pray these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, whose triumphant resurrection we celebrate this season. Amen. And now I present to you Maestro Brian Deering.
So for a few minutes, I'm going to torture you with some music appreciation here. The music that we are doing today is probably not at the top of anybody's top 10 list of music, but I think each one of them should be for a different reason. So I'm going to spend a little time and explain to you who these composers are, what their music is all about, and what to listen for when you hear it. So if I could have next slide, Todd. Next slide. So the first piece that you're going to hear is Mozart's Symphony number 29. How many people in this room are at least 18 years old? That's how old Mozart was when he wrote this. And it does not sound like the work of an 18-year-old. It certainly wasn't anything I was capable of when I was 18. Mozart lived a very short life. He lived only 35 years, and he lived in two cities, Salzburg and Vienna. This piece that you're going to hear was written at the end of his time in Salzburg before he went to Vienna. And I think there's just a little touch of rebellion in this piece that I think you'll hear. Mozart was a child prodigy. So, he was able to play by ear when he was 3 or 4 years old. He was able to reproduce from memory entire pieces of music. He'd hear the piece of music one time, and he'd go home and write it down, which is pretty amazing. But he wasn't just a prodigy. Most prodigies, we're amazed at them when they're young, and then they get to be 30 and they get kind of boring. So if you think about the great pianists of our age, most of them, the great pianists, most of them are 60, 70 years old or more, because there's a maturity that comes with years that is very difficult to duplicate when you're young. Mozart was able to cop that mature style at really a very young age. He was only 30 when he reached his final masterworks period. So he also was a performer. And all three of the composers you're going to hear were performers as well as composers. So he personally played the viola, he played the violin, he played the keyboard, obviously. And he very often participated in the music that he wrote. His music and Haydn's music come from what we call the classical period. So if you remember some of the recent Star Treks with Chris Pine, they play this hunk of rap music, and Dr. McCoy says, "Oh, classical music," meaning old. Well, classical is just a period within the history of music, and it's sort of late 18th century. It kind of tapers off in the beginning of the 19th century. But for both Mozart and Haydn, this was their home zone. They essentially invented the style. And Mozart was such a person. He and Haydn essentially invented the sonata form. And I'll mention that in a moment. There's one little fun fact about Mozart. We often hear that he died poor and he's in an unmarked grave. Well, at the time, the Landgrave of that area, decided that in order to save space in the cemetery, we would pile these bodies right on top of each other. And Mozart was one of those who was buried like that. Most people did not actually have a separate grave like we have today. So the fact that he was buried in an unmarked grave says nothing about whether or not he was rich or poor. And his wife, Constanza, after his death, turned out to be a fabulous financial manager. So I think that whole line about him being, too poor to be buried in a real grave is largely inaccurate. Next slide, please. So on the left-hand side of your screen, that's what I'm looking at. That's called the score. So if you read from the bottom is the double bass and the cello, and then the viola, and then the two violins, and then the top two lines are for the oboe on the top line and the horns on the next line. As a sort of an aside note, we think of horns, we have two of them here, as being in F, meaning when they play a C, the note that we hear is an F. However, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. Before the invention of valves, the horns could only play in one key or a very closely related key. So in this particular case, it's notated for horns in A, but French horn players are noted for their ability to transpose. I'm not making them transpose for this. So this piece was completed when he was 18 years old. Why did he leave Salzburg? Well, the reason he left Salzburg was the archbishop. He and the archbishop did not see eye to eye. The new archbishop decided that music wasn't that important and he was going to stop spending money on it. So big surprise, Mozart, for whom music was his life, decided, okay, I've had enough of this. I'm leaving for Vienna. So I think you can hear a little bit of that petulant rebellion in this piece. It combines kind of a chamber sound. Chamber means made to be presented in a small room. So you don't have 57 people in chamber music. You have maybe 10 or 18. So it's a small sound, but it's got a lot of impulsive bits. There are 4 movements. The first one is an allegro moderato, which that means relatively quick, so energetic. The andante is Latin for walk. So it's a walking tempo. And then we have the dance movement, where there's a minuet and a trio. Many of the pieces that you hear from this era were based on dance. So the notion of music and dance have gone together for centuries. And then you'll hear the allegro con spirito, which means fast and spirited. And in that case, you're going to hear what I think is Mozart's little bits of rebellion. Next slide, please. That's good enough. The one last thing is the sonata form. I threatened you I was going to tell you about what sonata form means. So sonata form, it doesn't mean it's a sonata. So like those of you who took piano lessons when you were a kid, you know, it says sonata in A. I played the sonata. Well, there were a gazillion sonatas. Sonata is a form, meaning a structure of the music. And essentially it works like this. You have two themes. You present them individually, then you smush them together and you vary them a little bit. That's called the development. And then you go back to the beginning and present them again. So it's much simpler than you think. And when you hear the symphony, you will hear both themes very clearly. 3 of the 4 movements are in sonata form. All right, next slide, please. After the intermission, we have a complete change of pace. How many of you have ever heard of Morten Lauridsen before? About 5% of you. Morten Lauridsen is the most performed living American choral composer. So of all the people that write choral music that are still alive, who are Americans, whose music gets performed, Morten Lauridsen is number 1. And you'll hear why. His writing is exquisite. There's no other way to describe it. It's just gorgeous. The harmonies are not what you expect, but after all, he's a professor of composition at USC, and so he's got a little bit of a modern touch, but not to the point where you want to close your ears. He spends his summers on a private island in the Pacific Northwest. It's quiet. He has a piano, one neighbor who never visits. And so he's alone with his own thoughts and his own music. And that's how he does it. He does it by himself in a solitary way. If you're interested in this man, there's a documentary that you can find on YouTube pretty easily. It's called Shining Knight. Shining Knight. Not knight in shining armor, but shining night as in after the day is over. And it's about a half hour, and it is fascinating. A study of a modern American artist. Next slide, please. So, why do I have a picture of the African Queen? How many of you saw the African Queen? About half of you. So the African Queen is a classic film from the 50s. Stars Henry Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. And it's set just prior to World War I. And, you know, there's a happy ending, as most movies of that time had. But the screenwriter of that movie wrote the text that you will hear Morten Lauridsen set. His name is James Agee. You may have read one of his books, which is about the Depression. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. It's a book where he took photographs of sharecroppers during the Depression and wrote the text around it. It's a marvelous, marvelous book. This text is taken from one piece of one poem from Agee's only book of poetry. And the poem is called Description of Elysium, which you can interpret as heaven, as an example. This same text has been set by many other composers, one of probably the most famous of whom is Samuel Barber. If you saw the movie Platoon, that theme that you hear in the background is Adagio for strings, which is his composition. Next slide, please. So, what to listen for? So let the music kind of wash over you. Don't analyze it too much. The real question that everybody asks is, what does it mean? Sure, on this shining night, okay, I get that part. I weep for wonder far alone. So Agee, like any good poet, doesn't tell you what the poem means. So it means what you think it means. Perhaps Agee himself, before he wrote the text, got a telescope and looked at Saturn through the telescope. So you can see up on the upper right-hand corner of the screen behind me, that's a telescopic picture of Saturn. He was fascinated by it. He was fascinated by the silence and by the immenseness of the whole thing. Is it about creation? Is it about being by yourself? Is it about contemplating nature? You'll have to decide when you hear it. Next slide, please. Our final work is by Haydn. Franz Joseph Haydn lived for 77 years. Pretty much the whole time he served the Esterházy family. So what that meant was he was a servant. So, you know, Downton Abbey, The Gilded Age, upstairs, downstairs, he's kind of like downstairs. At that point, musicians were kind of like butlers or footmen. You know, today, musicians have an exalted place. Not back then. They were in the service of their master. And in this case, it was the Esterházy family. The fact that he lived and worked pretty much in isolation, he said, made him more creative. The reason for that was there wasn't anybody else to influence him, so he had to do it himself. And in this music, you will hear just wonderful musical imagination. It's very challenging for the choir because the choir part and the orchestra part are completely independent of each other. Sometimes the orchestra is playing what the choir is singing, sometimes they're not. Next slide, please. So this is the Esterházy crest on the right-hand side. It dates back to like 1310. And this was written specifically for the court. So this is actually, even though it's a very mature sound, this is part of the early part of his career. Now, there's some kind of interesting little fun facts. The one fun fact is that this is the only mass from this period that includes English horns. English horns look like an oboe with a bump on the end of them. And they're keyed in F. So when the English horn player plays a C, we hear an F. The interesting thing is that Haydn completed this work a full year before his orchestra ever got English horns. So this is all in his head, and a year later, he gets to hear what it sounds like. He added the trumpet and timpani parts later on. So the first version, and sometimes if you listen to a recording online, sometimes they'll have the trumpet parts and the timpani, sometimes they don't. What makes this work unique is that he wrote a part for himself. And our own Joseph Haydn, Jim Norden, Dr. Jim Norden, is going to play that for us this evening. And so you can imagine Haydn playing this for himself. It's a virtuoso part. As they say in the movie Amadeus, too many notes. There's lots of notes in this. And as an aside, this is written, as many of his masses were, in honor of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Next slide, please. So the organ keyboard that you see there is called a continuo organ. And we use an electronic continuo organ here. There are no pedals. At the time in Vienna, most organs didn't have pedals. You had to go about 100 miles north, where Bach was living, or even further north where Buxtehude was living in the Netherlands, to find organs with pedals. English organs, for example, didn't have pedals at the time either. But at the time Haydn wrote this, organs in where he lived did not have pedals. So one of the things you're going to hear in this piece is a really independent orchestral sound. So the orchestra is a complete partner with the chorus. So the chorus is singing, the orchestra is playing, the parts mesh, but they don't land on top of each other. And there's a tremendous amount of variety in this piece. Sometimes we have soloists, sometimes we have a duet, sometimes we have a trio. And something that I think is relatively unique in the literature, we have the basses and the three the three soloists, rather than four soloists together. Our bass soloist is pretty irritated by that. He thinks he should have been able to sing that part. So you'll hear much variety and texture, and you have the words in front of you, and there's no question what these words are. These are the words from the Latin Mass, and they mean what the translation is pretty good. So, next slide. So thank you for listening. What questions can I answer for you? Yes, ma'am. The question is, Haydn wore a wig, so he must have had some status. Most servants did wear wigs. So the fact that he had a wig means that he wasn't a manual laborer, meaning he wasn't digging ditches or graves or something like that. But he was still a lower class individual. But that's a good question. What else? Yes, sir. Haydn was, the question is, when did Haydn become famous? The answer is, Haydn was famous in his own day. So he actually taught Beethoven. He taught Mozart, although Mozart became more of a colleague to him. Beethoven, as you can imagine, all the pictures of Beethoven, he's got his hair flying around, and he looks like a wild man. Well, he was, and he was no fun to teach, and Haydn had no fun teaching him. But Haydn was a famous man in his own time, so much so that near the end of his life, he went to England, where he was a tremendous success. The English were just delighted with him, and so you may have heard of his London symphonies. They all begin with a number 100 and something. He wrote those all four and played them in England. So he was famous in his own day. Anybody else? Going once? All right. Todd, I'm not sure what you want me to do with this. I'll tell you what, I'm going to hand it to you.
Your hair looks great. I like it on when you're parting it on the left side. Oh, sure. It is. There it is.
This shining night, the star-made shadows round. Kindness must watch for me this side the ground. On this shining night, this
Sure on Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Et in terra pars omnibus bone voluntatis. Bone voluntatis. Laudamus Te, benedicimus Te, adoramus Te, adoramus Te, glorificamus, glorificamus,
Gratias agimus, agimus tibi. Gratias agimus, agimus tibi. Propter maniam, propter maniam, propter Domine Filii unigenite. Domine Filii unigenite. Iesu Christe, Iesu Christe, Domine Deus Agnus Dei, Filius Patris, Filius Patris, Filius Patris, Patris. nationem nostram. Sedes qui sedes, ad exteram patris. Maria, Maria Virgine, et homo factus est. Et incarnatus est de Spiritui Sancto ex Maria, Maria Virgine, et homo factus est, et homo factus est. Et resurrexitentia die secundum scripturas et oscendit in caelum sit et ad exterum Patris Verit Thank